Hello, a warm welcome to our webinar. The Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies has just published a new study on economic challenges and costs of reintegrating the Donbas region in Ukraine. We are waiting maybe for attendees coming into our webinar room. There is a chat function on the right side. Good afternoon indeed. Hello. There you can type in also later on questions once we go into the discussion. And there is also in the handouts section on the upper right hand side, you can also download the presentations. And let me maybe introduce the presenters and panelists today, and also how we will structure this webinar. A few informations on that. The idea is first to have two of the three co-authors of the study presenting the main issues that were raised in the study. We will start with Artem Kochnev on the costs of the reconstruction. We will then move over to Peter Havlik, who will say something about the policy recommendations. The report is online on wiiw.ac.at, but I guess maybe we can also upload it to the handouts in a minute or so. Artem Kochnev is a PhD candidate at the Johannes Kepler University in Linz. Peter Havlik is a senior research associate at the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies and former deputy director of the institute. We will then later on have a panel discussion with very distinguished guests. We have Ambassador Sajdik, who until most recently was OSCE Special Envoy to Ukraine. We have also Velina Chakarova. She is the head of the Austrian Institute for European and Security Policy. And last but not least, we have Olga Pinyuk. She is Vienna Institute's Ukraine expert and also a co-author of the study. Okay, the numbers are going up. People are streaming into our webinar, and we have also at the very beginning a welcome address, a video of former Chancellor Dr. Wolfgang Schüssel, who is the spiritus rector of this study.
The military conflict in Donbas, in the eastern part of Ukraine, entered now its 6 years after 2014, and it is the bloodiest conflict in Europe after the war in former Yugoslavia. Thousands were killed, 3 times more were wounded, most of them civilians. But I think there's still the assumption that the conflict cannot be solved by military means, only by political efforts. And there's a chance to solve this conflict. First of all, we have the elements of the Minsk agreement, and now there is a study, a working paper prepared by the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies. And this paper shows the costs of restoring the economic situation in Donbas, and second, I think there is the political possibility that the parties are interested to solve the conflict. And this is a precondition for a lasting peace. First, the political will of the relevant parties. Second, enough efforts, also economic tools, to give hope for a better economic future, and third, an assistance from outside, and I think mentoring, and I think the European Union can deliver such an assistance and mentoring. I wish the debates following the paper of the WIIW Institute a good success, and I think it's an interesting part of the future debate for the future of Donbas. Thank you very much.
I would now like to ask Artem to start with his presentation.
May I ask Ronald to turn on the slides? Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you very much. So I guess I can start now, right? Thank you very much for joining us. As a PhD student, I'm very proud to present this work because it's not that often that as a PhD student, you can provide a policy advice on the biggest security issue in Europe. And I guess when we talk about wars, we have our own picture of how it looks like and what are the great consequences of that. But instead of just talking abstractly about this, I would prefer to let the people speak. So this is what one of the persons living in the areas closely affected by the war said once to the representative on UN human rights. This is what he said. He said that every night I go to sleep fully dressed because I don't want to look ridiculous when I get killed by shelling. Now, this sentence shows many things at once, but I want to highlight the most important one for our study. It shows the mode of survival that people are living in. And survival is just not compatible with economic development. And just to put it a little bit more in perspective of how strongly it affects the population in terms of numbers of the region that you see currently on the map, here's some simple metrics that you can use to get a very brief idea what the war has caused to the local population. So first of all, you have about 1.4 million of displaced population, which is roughly about 25% of the pre-war population of the region. You have 13,000 people dead, and you also had a GDP drop of roughly 50%, depending on the region that you're examining, which did not recover back from the most intensive stage of the conflict. So this means that you have years of lost development and years of also unrecovered development because the country or the region is still lagging behind the average of the country so far compared to the pre-war levels. Now the question is what you can do about this. And before you can answer this question, you need to do some accounting, right? You need to realize what was damaged and how big are the consequences of that. And this is what our study does. So we did some accounting, if you can put it this way, combined with some modeling assumptions, which we can discuss, and came up with a number. So our number that we came up with totally is $21.7 billion in the prices of 2018. About 44% of that is attributed to the fixed capital losses, which is simply in layman terms, this is your equipment, these are your plants, and these are your factories. About 40% comes from humanitarian expenditures, that means on the humans themselves, and part of that comes from the environmental part, which is the smallest ones. Now, there are three things that you have to keep in mind when looking at these numbers. First, this is the lower bound. It's the lower bound because certain factors are very hard to account for. For instance, the fact that fixed capital expenditures are greater than the humanitarian expenditures doesn't mean that, in fact, they're greater. I think they're not, but it's just way more tricky to account for human capital expenditures in terms of just methodology. The second part that you have to keep in mind is that the scale. And $21.7 billion sounds like a lot, but how much it is, in fact. And if you compare it with the Ukraine's revenues, it's more than 1/3 of Ukraine's state revenues as of 2019. So it means that Ukrainian taxpayers will not be able to pay it alone, and consequently, it means that you have to develop a specific strategy for the financing. If we then go to individual aspects of each individual dimensions, there are also specific things that I would like to highlight and bring to you because they also highlight the first theme that I put up in presentation, that is the survival mode. If you calculate the depreciation volumes as we did, and we did it just by taking the depreciation rate as of 2013 for the certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and then you apply to the fixed capital stocks as if it would not be recovered after that, which is a fairly reasonable assumption, you would come up with a number of 5.7 billion over the years. And this is greater than the direct damage that was done to the fixed capital assets that we estimated. What does it mean? Well, it means that the economic activity or the lack of economic activity, the inability of business to work in the certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions simply because it is, in fact, sort of an illegal area because it's not recognized by any United Nations member state, is not allowed to recover part of the costs in the business as usual mode. And it would be a big impediment to launch this engine back again. The second part that you have to take care about, and which we all very strongly emphasize in the study, is the composition of the humanitarian costs. Part of that is already reflected in the Ukrainian budget, which we call the social support. But there is a big part which is currently not really very well addressed, and this is related to the mental health issues, which is $3.6 billion estimated for the lifetime of the people affected by that. The mental health issues, it sounds like it's something maybe not really straightforward, but in fact, this is part of the disease taxonomy of the World Health Organization. And the surveys of the internally displaced population shows that 40% of people surveyed, they show the symptoms of mental health diseases, such as post-traumatic stress syndrome and depression. And these are things that usually stay with you for the rest of your life, and they cause a significant burden of your budget. So currently, people who are affected by this, they don't receive proper help. They are affected by the negative coping strategies. People just start drinking alcohol instead of proper treatment. And partly those who receive treatment, they pay money out of the cash. Yeah, so they have to pay like 50 US dollars in equivalent of US dollars per year. And this is an issue which is commonly overlooked and has to be addressed by the policy action as well, affecting consequently the well-being of the population there. The last part relates to environmental restoration, where of course the biggest part relates to the coal mining activities. The problem with the coal mines is that this is not the part, not the enterprise that you can just leave just like that if it is unprofitable. Coal mines are characterized by the fact that you drill the holes in the earth, and if you leave it just like that, you face two risks. First of all, you can contaminate the groundwaters, and then a lot of heavy metals will just come to your house in the very end, and this poses a very big environmental threat. And the second part relates to the fact that once you drill a hole in the earth, without proper maintenance, you're going to face a risk of geological stability. So you can just face the risk of Earth falling down by 1 meter, 2 meters, or 3 meters, and it's going to be a big trouble if it is very close to some urban areas, which you have to address. The problem with this calculation in general is that there are many risks which remain latent and they may materialize anytime. Just imagine if there is a random shelling taking into this closed sterile enterprise, which it was before the war, I think, the biggest European chemical enterprise in Europe. And there's going to be a big trouble, which is probably will be in its immediate impact, given the density of the population located close to that area, maybe on par or even greater than the Chernobyl disaster. So these are the things which are very hard to quantify, and you have to keep in mind while creating a plan of restoration of the region. Now, considering all that together, right, and considering the fact that the whole economy currently there is in a survival mode, to fix this, even if you have peace, conditional peace, you have to consider two factors. Like the first one, you have a vicious loop in terms of economics and the vicious loop in terms of politics. The vicious loop, and they are deeply intertwined with each other. What I mean is that if you have a big insecurity in the region and people don't know what to expect there, they're not coming to the region, they do not resettle. And this doesn't create necessary demand for the local enterprises to develop further, to develop more and invest in the region. And since there is lack of investment, even less people will willingly come there to restore it. And so you end up with a vicious loop of first economics, because you cannot create a sustainable economy, but you also have vicious loop of politics, because you would not be able to build trust, because nothing is happening and people would be dissatisfied with the peace process in the very end, increasing the likelihood of another round of any type of insurgency or dissatisfaction, public discontent. So what you should do as a policymaker? Well, first of all, as I said, security is the key there. And this is what you can address with demining the territories and in eliminating environmental threats. It's fairly straightforward to do if you have enough finance. And even if you don't have enough state capacity for that, you can hire external people. And this is what actually is going on currently in Ukraine, when non-government organizations like HALA, they come there and demine the areas there in the government-controlled territories. It gives the immediate impact, and it gives a strong signal to the local population that the government cares about them and that the peace process works. Now, this will raise some little level of trust, and people will start considering maybe going back to this insecure zones. Now, even if they declare, like sometimes in the surveys, there are numbers like 40% of the internally displaced people say they would like to come back conditional on security, there is a big gap between really saying this and really coming back. So for that, you will need to help people to do this. And for that, you would need to address the humanitarian crisis. Like, you will need to assure that people have some basic living standards there: access to food, access to water, access to electricity and heating. Second part, you need to be sure that the reallocated populations go there smoothly and help them to overcome initial costs of that. And the most easy way to do so is to introduce the cash assistance programs. So direct cash transfer to the population. Yes, it is expensive, but it helps to create the initial trust, and it helps to overcome the initial burden. And people will see that things are going forward, that government really cares about people, and this will create the necessary demand for the local businesses to start growing. Now, to be able to create a more long-term perspective of that, because you don't want just to create some, hairdressers, or just, some simple services. It's a necessary part of the economy, but if you want to create the long-term engine of the economic growth, it's not enough. So you would need to address two things at least. First of all, you will need to be able to provide a smooth transition of property rights from the certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions to the mainland Ukrainian legal system. And it's going to be a very massive issue. It's going to be subject to a lot of negotiations. And it's a very hard topic, which has to be detailedly discussed. What you have to keep in mind is that fairness in this process is the key. If you will treat the corporate enterprises more favorably than the small and medium enterprises during the process, you will give a very strong narrative for the opponents of the peace process, which will necessarily use it to undermine it and start again the old song about, poor Donbas folk against the central mainland Ukraine, which you don't want to have. Second part, you want to set up a stage for the investment in the region, which initially, again, would face the same problems as the reallocated population with a lot of uncertainty. So you would need to set up a preferential investment schemes. At least this is what we advocate. The details of that, they have to be clearly elaborated and should be done in detail in cooperation with legal experts and finance experts, because you don't want to end up in a situation when companies in Ukraine or wherever they are set up some shell enterprises, use these preferential tax schemes, and then reallocate these profits to the companies in Cyprus or Luxembourg or Liechtenstein. This is not what you want to end up with. Therefore, you have to put a lot of attention to setting up a proper legal background and conditionalities to be able to launch this project in a proper way. And then even if this is what you achieve, this is not the very end, because you need to assure the post-war resilience. And this is a very important step which often fails among all conflict-affected countries and regions across the world. Because when you execute this plan, it doesn't happen in the vacuum. There are always shocks kicking every now and then. Oil prices, epidemics, political changes in the country who want to revise the previous political agreements. So if you want to be able to tackle them, you cannot avoid them at all. This is impossible, and practically this is not what you can do. What you can do, though, is what you can improve the resilience of the political system itself. You should give the people who live there, the local population, real tools, effective tools that help them to achieve their social needs through political means. And that means the support of political engagement. It means support of the local parties. It means teaching of the population how to use the administrative reform that Ukraine is pushing to their favor, and how they can express their preferences on the bigger level, not just on the local level, but the level of the whole Ukraine. And even only after that, you can be more or less sure that the plan is going to work. Thank you very much. That was all from my side. I'm giving the floor to the next speaker, and I guess it's Peter.
No, wait a second, Artyom. There is just maybe a question that came up regarding the figures. They represent which period? Is this like a snapshot, I would assume? Or?
Well, these are the costs which we expect for the remaining, for the lifetime. Let's put it this way.
Okay, but from now on, so to speak.
From now on, yes. So this is
okay. There have been a few other questions, but these I think makes sense that we keep them for the end discussion. And now, Peter, please your presentation on policy recommendations.
Thank you, Mario. Welcome, everybody. First of all, I would like to thank to my colleagues who worked very hard on this complicated issue. I have to point out at the very beginning that we had a very long, intensive, and sometimes controversial discussions, especially regarding the reconstruction plan and its individual stages. I shall perhaps come to this later on during my presentation, and of course we will have the possibility to point these controversial issues during the discussion. So let me first repeat what just Artyom said at the end about the reconstruction plan. So all our recommendations and reconstruction ideas basically rely on the assumption that there will be a lasting ceasefire settlement in Ukraine, in the Donbas. And then these four key stages can be basically implemented. Now, if we go into more specific general recommendations, I have basically divided these general recommendations into four parts. Some of them are pretty obvious, some of them are not so much obvious, and they are possibly more controversial. So the first general recommendation is continue the reform path in the Ukraine for achieving a sustainable and inclusive economic growth. This will be also facilitated by policies that would attract both domestic and foreign investment. What we have found during our analysis was that, especially regarding the foreign investment, Ukraine has been performing pretty disappointingly compared to regional peers. Of course, there is a situation of political instability, there is a conflict or even war in eastern Ukraine, and this is, of course, something which is not particularly attractive for foreign investors and even for domestic investors. Domestic Ukrainian investors are very often flying the domestic market and use different offshore destinations to, so to say, hide their investment. The other general recommendation, and again, this is partly a repetition what Artyom has just said, is that the purpose of the reform is to improve well-being of the Ukrainian citizens. And last but not least, of course, the purpose of the reforms is to increase potential opportunity costs of the conflict, to create conditions that the conflict would be increasingly costly for stakeholders. both within Ukraine and outside. The second general recommendation is to try to implement policies that would aim at the revival of trade and labor markets. One of the issues which we have discussed very intensively is that we believe that in the post-conflict environment, and I would like to underline this assumption, post-conflict environment, Ukraine should strive for balanced trade relations with the rest of the world, including Russia and including the Euro-Asian Economic Union. This is easy said, but very difficult to implement. But nevertheless, both the economic theory and the experience of other countries show clearly that this is a very important. Also, what is important to aim for a diversified basket of import and exports, while avoiding conflicts with other trade agreements. Of course, we are very well aware that Ukraine has been implementing deep and comprehensive free trade area with the European Union, and that it is not so easy to conclude or participate in other trade arrangements, but still there are policies which would permit avoiding this conflict. Related to this issue, we also argue for abolishing of blockades and restoring functioning labor markets and other state services in the Donbas region, especially in these non-government controlled areas, or how it is called, certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. So a normal functioning of labor markets, of labor movements, population movements between these areas have to be restored in order to revive the labor markets. And last but not least, in this labor market and social issues, is important to develop a cash assistance programs for refugees and internally displaced persons. And these assistance programs should be made contingent on their long-term resettlement in Donbas, including non-government controlled areas. So this is the second part of general recommendation. The next part is ensuring the lasting ceasefire settlement. And this, again, has many different aspects. What is proposed and what is partly already stipulated by the existing agreements in Minsk II, and also in the last Normandy-Paris summit in December 2019, is the initiative to adopt a constitutional change as foreseen by these agreements which were signed by Ukrainian authorities. I know very well that in parts of Ukrainian society, this is not a very popular or even acceptable proposition, but nonetheless, I believe that this is very much essential for achieving this lasting ceasefire settlement and, in the end, the reconstruction of the Donbas. How to do it is, again, a very much question for discussion. One of the options is to consider an additional agreement that would both help to implement but also complement Minsk II agreement. This is, again, easier said than done, but still, this is something for diplomats that goes beyond the purely economic analysis which we're trying to do. In any case, the policies should also aim at preventing the state from pursuing post-war discriminatory policies against former political opponents. So we are not here advocating for giving a general amnesty for people who were engaged in some criminal activities, but nevertheless the population which was left in the Donetsk and Luhansk regions should be integrated into the Ukrainian society and economy. As far as this new potential agreement is concerned, one should establish also a supervisory mechanism that would ensure that both parties adhere to the settlement procedure. Again, easy said than done, but nevertheless, this is our recommendations. The next one is the policy supporting the post-war resilience. Again, this has been mentioned already at the beginning in the presentation by my colleague Artem. What we propose basically is just to establish a small high-level expert supervisory body which would be composed of the main stakeholders in the development of Ukrainian economy. European Union, the IMF, EBRD, OSCE, all these international institutions should help to supervise the implementation of the reform and reconstruction efforts. However, we strongly believe that the coordination of reconstruction activities should be left to Ukrainian authorities in order to assure both responsibility and have the so-called domestic ownership of all reform. This is very important, and it is also well known from the experience of other countries. The external supervision should provide just a basis for monitoring of reconstruction activities and also, of course, look at or take control or trying to avoid a potential abuse of international assistance, as we know that the issue of corruption is very much acute also in the Ukrainian environment. Then the next point is that how to finance the whole reconstruction effort. Again, this has been much debated during the work on this study. One possibility is, of course, for Ukrainian authorities and Ukrainian government, especially attractive, is to use international courts for seeking a compensation of conflict costs from Russia and so on. But beside the seeking, so to say, legal court solutions, the Ukrainian government also should accept support for the economic restoration of Donbas from Russia. And this is, again, something which is basically foreseen by the Minsk II agreement. And last but not least, there should be an international monitoring mission that would secure the enforcement mechanism. So these are basically, in a very abridged way, our key proposals for the reconstruction plan. Thank you very much for your attention. The whole paper can be freely downloaded from the website of the Vienna Institute, and we are very much looking for your comments, suggestions, and criticism. Thank you.
There have been again a number of questions coming from the audience. Artem is trying to answer some of them in the chat function, especially if it's with regard to the study, which we will also upload here in the handouts. So that will be done in a minute, I guess. Now, let me move on to our panel. And we have, as I mentioned, Ambassador Sajdik here with us, Verina Chakarova and Olga Pindyuk. And I would like to maybe start with Ambassador Sajdik, if he could also open his video. Yes, thanks a lot. Now we have heard the main points from the study on the reconstruction, but how realistic is actually the reconstruction of the Donbas currently? And also I got a question maybe added to that from the audience. What can, for instance, OSCE do to start the realization of the recommendations that were made?
Well, thank you very much for inviting me for the presentation of the study. And I do think that this is really a necessary step, that we now have an idea about figures and about how to proceed with an economic reconstruction of the whole of the Donbas. It's not only the reconstruction of the certain areas of the Donetsk and Lugansk region, but it is at least of the whole two oblasts of Donetsk and Lugansk. And I do believe that also this approach is important, has to be understood. Let me start with a personal observation. You know, I was in charge of the negotiations in Minsk for 4.5 years, and I have traveled in the Donbas to the east of the country, Ukraine, often and extensively. And in the end of 2015, after taking over, I had visited the area of the crossing point in the only crossing point in the Lugansk region in Stanitsa Luganska. And what I saw there in December of 2015 was simply appalling. People were, crossing at the crossing point, but it was actually on the way from one to the other side, to put it very bluntly, a huge hole. And the people who crossed had to step down, get down a wooden board with some very small wooden bars. It was icy, and then get up again on the other side in order to cross from one side to the other. People, broke their legs, their arms. In the summer, there were heart attacks because of the conditions of this crossing point. I was the first one to speak about this also in the OSCE, in the Permanent Council, and there was growing awareness that something has to be done. And at a certain point, many also foreign visitors had gone to Stanitsa Luganska to see what is all about, this completely non-humane condition for the people to cross from one side to the other. And we were then discussing the reconstruction of this access, of this end of the bridge. And the sides were quarreling for months, for years, about the possible breadth of the bridge. And they could not decide, be it 2.2 meters or 2.80 meters. And we could discuss, endlessly, and no solution was found. When President Zelensky was elected, he then visited the area, and he decided to take a personal initiative on this, and to do what it can be done to reconstruct this access. And in fact, this was done very, very fast. And within a couple of months, this hole disappeared. And the new auxiliary construction was there. And people could cross. I saw it personally, who had never been able to cross before. People handicapped, very old people. They could now walk on an equal level from one side to the other. And what I would like to say is, if there is a will, reconstruction can be done very, very fast. And if there is a will, then the people also see the positive sides of reconstruction. And to some extent, for me, this reconstruction of the bridge in Stanitsa Luganska is kind of a symbol for if there is a will, a lot can be done, and it can be done very fast. But unfortunately, we don't see this political will and for the rest of the nearly 420 kilometers of what is called the line of contact. So we only see it in Stanitsa Luganska, but it is a symbol for if you want it, you can do it. And if the people want it, they can do it. And you can do it from both sides. And that simply has to be the will. So that's the first observation. Second observation, many aspects, many of the economic aspects of the Minsk agreements are unfortunately far from implementation. This especially concerns the issue of financial services. If there is no banking across the line of contact, then one unfortunately cannot speak of any reconstruction. Another aspect that has to be dealt with is finally what we, in general terms, call the economic blockade. The measures that were installed in March 2017 after the blockade of some railway lines on the Ukrainian side. These measures have simply to be lifted. We have to get there into the reverse gear. We have to get into having economic activities again across the line of contact. People know that, and there are ideas floating how to do it, but this has to be done in real terms. And it has to be also clear that both sides have to contribute to this, on both sides of the line of contact. And this is extremely important. One has to get into this reverse gear. This is simply a precondition for any reconstruction of the area. A third observation. Last year, at the beginning of last year, much talk was about what was called a peace plan that was introduced and tabled by my colleagues, Ambassador Apakan, Ambassador Borrell, and myself, on an international involvement for solving the crisis in eastern Ukraine. And one major aspect of this plan was actually the economic reconstruction. We foresaw a great part in this plan for economic reconstruction. And I'm therefore extremely glad that we now have a study which serves now as a basis for any discussion of what this economic reconstruction should look like. And here, Artem has touched some very important aspects of this. That for reconstruction, also you have to consider the humanitarian costs. You have to consider the mental costs. You have to consider also the environmental costs. And first of all, also there is one important compulsory aspect besides ceasefire, that is mine clearance. But at the bridge in Stanitsa Luganska, one could see that if you want it, also mine clearance can go very fast. And the mine clearance happened from both sides. So if there is a will, there is a way. And mine clearance could happen. And one did not have to resort to outside mine clearance. The sides were doing the mine clearing themselves. And I guess they did it pretty efficiently. So yes, mine clearance is a prerequisite. Unfortunately, eastern Ukraine, the area on both sides of the line of contact, is now the most highly mined area in Europe. This is what is the result of this conflict, to have it as the most highly mined area in Europe. And certainly, without the removal of mines, reconstruction cannot be possible. Because reconstruction really also means that the ordinary people can go to their dachas across the line of contact, that they can fish in the many ponds that are there in the area, and not, or farm without the hazard of stepping on a mine. That is also a precondition for this reconstruction. I'm very glad that this study is really pointing to this. When we spoke about the reconstruction of the Donbas in our plan, we also spoke very much about the necessity of fighting corruption in the context of the reconstruction. And Peter mentioned this aspect, and I'm glad that he mentioned this aspect. This is absolutely necessary. If one has to have an effective use of the money that should come for the reconstruction, one has to fight corruption. And we had in our plan foreseen quite some strict measures for being able to fight corruption in this context. For me, this is absolutely key. And corruption is not only, that one gets, under-table money. Corruption can be also indirectly in the form of not taking any decisions and hoping to get some benefits out of this. So one has to be very clear on this, what we also mean in this context and how we want to proceed. But this, from my point of view, is key. And a final observation. What you have to change, unfortunately, for any reconstruction is the mindset. The mindset that is at the moment really in place on both sides of the line of contact, but unfortunately, specifically in the certain areas. One has to understand that the idea of the Minsk, the basic idea of the Minsk agreements is a united Ukraine, and that the certain areas of the Donetsk and Lugansk regions, oblasts, form part of a united Ukraine. And for this, you need a mindset, especially in the certain areas, that they have to think about to be together in Ukraine and with Ukraine. If one listens to comments from there and sees them, then one cannot, unfortunately, see an understanding for this togetherness. Certainly, there are reasons, and for this, and one can get into a very deep discussion on this. But the togetherness, this mindset, is very much important. One also have to. There is also a necessity for forgiving each other. That is a precondition. And if one does not see that, it will be difficult to change the mindset. The people on both sides of the line of contact, they have to see, they have to have a vision of a joint future. And I think we have to support this also. And I'm sure that this study that we have here now, if it is well understood on both sides of the line of contact, in Kiev and in Moscow and elsewhere where there is interest in this, then this study is, from my point of view, a great tool to understand how we could go further. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let me ask maybe Belina now. What are the interests of Ukraine, Russia, but maybe also the EU in this process? And maybe to pick up also a question from the audience, what is the interest of the US in all of this?
Thank you very much for this invitation, and my congratulations to the organizers of the Vienna Institute for International Economic Studies for this event. Also, my congratulations to all authors being involved in this study, which certainly will build a very important fundament for further discussions on that matter. And let me point to some geopolitical challenges regarding the reintegration of Donbas region into the Ukrainian state. Now, it was mentioned right from the start that this has been by far the most volatile and unresolvable geopolitical issue on the European continent since 2014. From the Ukrainian point of view, the preconditions for a peaceful integration of Donbas cannot bypass the annexation of Crimea, and that would require certainly restoring of Ukraine's sovereignty. Now, from Russia's point of view, the current low intensity military conflict in eastern Ukraine actually serves Moscow's geopolitical interests better than a possible reintegration of these territories into the Ukrainian state, which is why we should expect further disruptive actions and a rather disruptive role by Russia in this region. Now, we've witnessed actually a warming between Ukraine and Russia on the level of the presidents, following a first tete-a-tete meeting with the newly elected Ukrainian President Zelensky in December 2019 in Paris. But this did not result in a major breakthrough. Thus, for now, we should actually consider the resumption of the diplomatic negotiations as progress in itself. The nature of the Minsk agreements, as we all know, is non-binding, which is why there is, in fact, no strong mechanism for compliance aside from the necessary political will and the factual readiness to implement the agreements. Now, Ukraine has been promoting the idea of introducing an international occupational administration in Donbas under the guise of a UN peacekeeping force. On the other side, the passportization process initiated by Russia creates an additional problem and blocks, in fact, the implementation of the Minsk agreements for now. So what about the European stakeholders in this process? The Normandy format is the most significant additional layer, institutional and political one. And thanks to the German Chancellor Merkel, who has been part of the process from the very beginning, but also Macron as the successor of the French President Hollande, who is also very engaged. The format has been further filled with the substance and is slowly, very slowly, but still moving forward. The Normandy format met together in December last year, reached a new agreement for all exchange between Ukraine and the occupied Donbas by December 2019. The division of forces in 3 new designated sections by March 2020, the prolongation of the law on the peculiarities of local governments, and full ceasefire by the end of 2019. Now, a next Normandy format is being planned and is being in the making, hopefully will take place by the end of June. However, there are still existing problems which have a geopolitical nature. Now, the agreement did not and still does not appear to resolve any of the underlying issues of this conflict. There was also no agreement, for example, on a full disengagement along the 265-mile front line, and there was no agreement about elections in the conflict zone, and discussion of that matter of Ukraine's eastern border under de facto Russian control since 2014 did not get far. Likewise, there was also no breakthrough on the parallel issue of gas transit contracts. And this issue is going to become even more problematic in 2020. As we all know, it remains a sensitive point ahead of the anticipated completion of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline linking Russia to Ukraine. So according to the director of Naftogaz, which is the Ukraine state-owned oil gas company, the sides merely agreed to keep trying to agree. Now, obviously, dialogue between Russia and Ukraine on the highest ranking political level is very much welcomed and necessary. But considering the destruction caused by more than 6 years of war, it will not be straightforward. So the Ukrainians on both sides of the conflict line are actually the ones who continue to suffer. And we've heard from our colleagues already about the devastating implications of this war. Now, the new President Zelensky pushed hard on a pledge to end the war within 12 months of assuming office. Since his landslide win, many other things have got in the way. Not last, of course, COVID-19, but prior to that also becoming involved in an impeachment inquiry in the United States. His strategy is, of course, linked to great domestic criticism. He has been accused of naivety, fanatical stubbornness. He has been criticized for agreeing to concessions without first securing a shift in the Kremlin's position. In reality, we do not expect a shift in Kremlin's position in 2020 and in the next future. So political fallout has already hit also the president's approving ratings, as we know, dropping 20 percentage points from a high of above 70% just a few months ago. So Moscow, on the other side, understands very well that there is little prospect of the new Ukrainian president to comply with the Minsk Accords and stay in power. No Ukrainian president can fulfill the Minsk agreements as they are written right now without provoking a huge negative reaction at home. So what about the European Union leaders? They have agreed to extend diplomatic economic sanctions against Russia for another 6 months just recently. Merkel criticized openly Russia for not taking sufficient steps to implement the Minsk agreements. The sanctions were imposed in response, as we know, in response to the illegal annexation of Crimea by Russia. And so far, the United States, the European Union, the UN General Assembly, and all relevant regional actors view Russia's annexation of Crimea as illegal. So no change on that and no shift on that to official positions is expected in the near future. Now, the European Union regulators have extended economic sanctions for 6 months, as I mentioned, and prolonged also sanctions on Crimea and Sevastopol for a year in response to what the European Union says is the deliberate destabilization of Ukraine. This is how actually the official position on the matter is when it comes to the European Union institutions. The economic sanctions target specific sectors of the Russian economy, including financial services, energy, and the arms sector. So basically the really key fields from a Russian perspective. And the leaders also determined during their summit on June 19, they agreed actually to proceed with the rollover of the sanctions, as it concluded Russia has again failed to implement the agreements. Now, according to the recent US statements on the Normandy agreement's progress from December, and apart from extending the law on special order of local governance in separate areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions, and 2 exchanges of prisoners related to the conflict, not much was done in spite of constructive approach of the Ukrainian leadership. That's the official statement. And yet, the European diplomats made an emphasis on the necessity to reach full ceasefire as a condition of peaceful solution of the conflict, and restoration of the sovereignty and territorial integrity of the Ukrainian state within its internationally recognized borders. Now, let me sum up a final point from a geopolitical perspective. It is in reality the sequencing of the Minsk agreement that has proven most contagious and will be probably the greatest challenge to reintegrating the Donbas region in Ukraine. Moscow insists on preserving the order in which they appear on the paper. Ukraine argues its sovereignty would be undermined if elections take place before securing border control. So the sequence from the Ukrainian point of view is the one including ceasefire, Russia's withdrawal from eastern Ukraine, return of the Russian-Ukraine border to Ukrainian control, and free and fair elections in the Donbas region, resulting in a limited devolution of power to Russia's proxy regimes, which then will be reintegrated into the authorities in Ukraine. Now, Russia sees the sequence, as I've mentioned, from a different perspective, and that is why it seeks actually to break Ukraine's sovereignty. That's actually the aim of the matter. Its interpretation reverses key elements in the sequence, namely elections in the occupied Donbas region will take place before Ukraine had reclaimed control of the border. Now, from geopolitical point of view, the conflict has been sliding into no solution territory. This is going to be a process of no major breakthroughs, but series of incremental small steps. Thus, it's important to keep the momentum and to not allow setbacks due to sudden escalations that unfortunately are still expected. There might be improvements, but also, like I said, there might be sudden escalations. But this is turning into more or less, unfortunately, next frozen conflict, which means that it entered the phase of normalization as actually is the Russia's point of view, which is also the gray area where Russia operates in this region, or status quo, if you like, which serves rather the Russian, rather than the Ukrainian interests. Now, what the European and, because the question was also about the United States, can do is basically to keep promoting all the comprehensive package of stabilizing the Ukrainian state from institutional process, from so that means good governance, all the package from democratization, rule of law, economic reforms to society, because one of the greatest capital Ukraine has is now, of course, the Ukrainian citizens. So all these three layers, institutions, authorities, key fields of policy, and civilians need to be part of the process. The particular role of United States has been, from Ukrainian point of view, once again, geopolitical point of view, very, very important one. The United States supports the so-called political integration of Ukraine into the NATO formats. It is not about NATO enlargement at that point, but Ukraine is a serious partner of NATO members. Many NATO members is always part of the dialogue. On the European Union side, the association agreements and the deep and comprehensive free trade area agreement, this is the fundament, so to say, for Ukraine to build up. And in fact, this is the only long-term comprehensive solution for Ukraine, which includes all key elements of the process towards stabilization of the Ukrainian state. And so far, there is something in the making. These kind of studies are very, very important for the process, but we should keep in mind also the geopolitical realities on the ground when we want to proceed with realistic solutions. Thank you very much.
Now, last but not least, let me turn to Olga. What is basically the economic dimension of all of this? And maybe just briefly also, how does the current COVID crisis affect the region? And maybe also to add maybe a question or comment from the audience that touches upon the issue of industrial restructuring, which is certainly will be necessary for the region, but it's not necessarily covered in our cost estimates. But the question arises, well, how will it work? Probably we have to rely on foreign direct investment here, no?
Thank you. Well, let me start with COVID, which is another one in the room. Yeah, that's a big problem now for Ukraine, as for any other economies, and Ukraine has difficulties to dealing with it because of limited fiscal space and healthcare system being not in a very good condition. So now the attention definitely shifted away from the conflict in the east, and most of the narrative in media now is devoted to the COVID-19. And economically, though, the decline in GDP, which is expected due to the epidemics, is not going to be a decisive factor in terms of future plans of potential reconstruction of Donbas. The cost of reconstruction, even by our lower bound estimates, are so big that Ukrainian government wouldn't be able to deal with it with its own resources in any case, even in case of remarkably good economic performance. And I must say that after initial economic shock, which the Donbas conflict and annexation of Crimea was for the Ukrainian economy, this time the economy has adjusted. So until the current epidemic started, it hasn't been really a big factor determining economic performance of the country. Moreover, there has been quite remarkable macroeconomic stabilization in the country. The central bank managed to put inflation and exchange rate under control and decrease quite significantly the policy rate. Everything is going in a good direction. The economic growth last year exceeded expectations. So it's like economy adjusted to a new normal. There is a conflict, which is de facto not even frozen, but it's being overlooked. I mean, people are used to it in a way. And have sorry, Mario, what else can I add from economy point of view? I'm not sure in this dimension. Maybe I can also briefly react to the previous panelists if you think it's okay.
Sure, we can. I think we can start the session where the panelists can comment maybe on each other's statements, and then we can open up for the general discussion. I would read some of the comments from the audience, but please maybe just brief comments. We are already more than 1 hour on time.
Yeah, I will just briefly say that I am in full agreement with Velena's points, that Russia is basically, it's a big actor in all this situation. And when we are talking about side of the conflict, that's a side which has a big geopolitical interest in maintaining the conflict running. And when we are thinking about what are the realistic prospects of ending the conflict and then switching to restoration of Donbas, of trying to reintegrate it, we must first, I think, very important actually to understand how realistic it is and what shape and form it can be and what time frame. And at the moment, the geopolitical reality looks not so promising. That goes as well to some of the policy recommendations. My comments go I think Peter Havlik said about diversifying foreign trade towards Russia, or developing forgiveness. I think all these issues are beyond the realm of possibilities at the moment, because when there is a currently ongoing active military conflict, there is no possibility to have a free trade agreement or increased trade in that direction. That has to be kept in mind. The same goes to lifting blockades. If the Ukrainian government has no control over its borders, then it's really questionable how it can be implemented, lifting of blockades, or also linking back banking systems of the currently occupied territories and the rest of the country. That would be my comments shortly.
Would any of the speakers so far would like to maybe comment on others, on the comments of the others, in a quick round, just some brief reaction? Yeah, you would have to turn on your mic.
Maybe if I may raise my hand.
You're live.
Yeah. Can you hear me? Yeah. Just a few additional considerations to the discussion. Well, I've been arguing, and the report basically has been arguing for a negotiated solution of the conflict in Donbas, or war in the Donbas, because I am personally very much convinced that negotiations are the only alternative, as was said by several speakers before. Only the negotiation can lead to some results, especially if we take into account the situation of the local population, the human capital. One has to see that even the frozen conflict, which is still not frozen there, in the certain areas of Donbas and Luhansk region, would be a certain kind of progress, you know. And we have to take into account that we have a number of other frozen conflicts on the post-Soviet space, in Georgia, in Moldova, and Donbas is a different dimension. It is by the order of magnitude much bigger, especially in terms of human suffering and humanitarian cost. And as far as the recommendations are concerned, as was several times repeated during the presentation as well, the reconstruction plan and the recommendations assume a post-conflict situation. You know, that means that we assume that there is some negotiated solution, and then one can start with implementing the reconstruction plan. So this is just some additional explanation about our thinking.
Thank you. Peter. Artem, Velina, Ambassador, would you like to have a quick reaction? Otherwise, I would maybe summarize some of the questions, but if you would like to say something now, you have to turn on the mic if you want to say something.
Yep. Yeah. Just to stress one possible development, geopolitical development for this year, which might put additional stress on the process of not only reintegrating the Donbas region in Ukraine, but the process of any any political resolvement of the conflict, and that is that we have also observed geopolitical rapprochement right now coming from the German and French capital towards Russia, and that has different factors in mind. That's not the place for a discussion. However, we should keep in mind that this, of course, rapprochement will, that's my expectation as a geopolitical analyst, will put a further stress on any efforts coming from Ukraine specifically to navigate through the muddy waters of specifically of the political challenges and the geopolitical challenges in the region, which are going to increase. We are observing tectonic shifts already taking place globally, and this specific region will not be spared from them. So this is one remark I wanted to make because I didn't do it during my presentation. And then here it will be very, very important that on the institutional layer, which is the European Union Commission and the other institutions, it's going to be even more important for them to strengthen the process of negotiations, where actually Ukraine, the political elite, is doing their, so to say, homework when it comes to implementing the various reforms as agreed between the European Union and Ukraine. And third remark, it's going to be also very, very important to wait for the US election, because in reality, under Trump administration, Ukraine was in fact one of the countries that witnessed stable, positive development of the bilateral relations. Let me just remind you that Ukraine received military aid, additional financial aid, and so on and so forth, military equipment during Trump administration. So actually a possible re-election of Trump would not be necessarily a bad news for the Ukrainian political decision makers. That's on my side.
Well, may I just add one observation? If I understand very well, at this juncture, there have been also direct contacts between the main actors on the Russian and Ukrainian side on Minsk and the implementation of the Minsk agreements. And Yermak, who is the political advisor, foreign policy advisor, and chief of the cabinet of President Zelensky, and Kozak, who is in charge in the Kremlin administration of the Donbas, they had met in Minsk, I think about in person about 10 days ago. And so there are direct contacts, which is, I think, at least something that one has to register. And this may also then have some effect on a further intensification of the work within the Normandy format. Another observation is that I think that the process of decentralization in Ukraine is continuing, and this might, if I'm right, this might lead to local elections in autumn. And so the question will then also be, will there be also local elections held in the certain areas, which is, the key element of the Minsk agreements, the holding of local elections there. And so I think we should be also optimistic that there could be some progress. I cannot say that there will be some progress, but I see that there is work done. We hear about this. We can read about it, and let's also hope for the better. If we always wait for the result of elections in the US or wherever, and then think about the possible effect on the Donbas, we will always have a lot of outside forces. But we also should see, if I may say so, the inside developments, and there might be some positive inside developments.
Well, I would like to ask the audience to write in the chat questions, comments. I might now summarize a few questions and comments that were there before. And maybe some of the speakers could just pick whatever they question they would like to answer. So Ambassador Vukovic, for instance, had a question on the estimated financial support of Russia to the certain areas. There was a question by Günther on what the role of the UK and China might be over the next years, both politically as well as economically. There was another question on high FDI inflows from Russia to the region and how to interpret that. Then Olga had a question whether we really should talk about reconstruction or building back that could be better, and what was calculated. I would say it was rather the reconstruction calculated, and also even asked whether the burden will really be basically on Ukraine. Yes, that is the assumption here in the study, I would say. Yaroslav was asking whether, and that relates to the issue of that was mentioned before about the industrial restructuring, whether we actually really want to reconstruct the economy as it was before, or whether we rather should look at a new type of economy in the region. And Georg mentioned that the difficult situation at the borders, also the eastern borders of the region and so on, and how to really channel help into the region. Okay, maybe let me stop here, and I would like to ask any of the speakers who might want to react to one or more of these questions to unmute their mic and comment.
Maybe I start about answering this question about the Russian support for the certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Well, indeed, there is some information in the study about this. We do not know actually the real figures, but Russian official sources have admitted that they provide some support. For example, Russia has been paying salaries of government, so-called government employees in certain areas of Donetsk and Luhansk regions. Russia has provided until recently also some reconstruction assistance related to rebuilding of the housing stocks in the certain areas. Russia has been also providing gas to these areas essentially for free. And there has been some complicated schemes how to deliver this gas and so on. So generally answering yes, there has been some Russian assistance, but we do not exactly how much it is worth, but definitely it has been substantial, especially for these certain areas. And this is all assistance without any military component, about which we do not have virtually any information. So if this is an answer, thank you.
Any quick reaction from the speakers on one or the other question?
Yes, I would like to comment on the question of building back better, and all related to that because there are several questions in chat relating essentially to the same topic. So first of all, one thing to realize in our exercise is that we follow in a certain way a historical approach, backward-looking approach. So when we say about the capital costs and the losses of capital costs, like let's say $5 billion of depreciation, right? We assume that we should then build it back as it was before the war. Yeah, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case, right? Because as I said before, Ukraine is generally characterized by a high capital to population ratio in general, which is probably a poor legacy from Soviet Union, which was heavily oriented on the material economy and not the services. Services was not considered a part of the material economy. This is what Ukraine also inherited as an economy in general. Now, you don't want to rebuild all these old enterprises, in fact. The problem is that assessing what exactly you have to invest in, it's very hard while sitting in the office in Vienna. Yeah, so that's why we use this simplified approach to approximate the costs. In fact, this is my opinion, it is way better to create a new economy based on services and some highly intangible assets in Donbas after that. Some friends of mine who come from Donetsk city, they're great programmers. And they can deliver, I think, great products based on Java programming language. And this is what companies should strive for and what the policies ideally should be designed for. The problem is that estimating or evaluating where to invest exactly, specifically, it requires way more information that we currently possess. And it's a topic of a series of studies, in fact, rather than a single study.
I might also add a question very close to Velina and another one.
Sorry, Mario, I just wanted to say briefly about industrial destruction, since it's really related closely to what Artem was saying about the cost of, about the methodology of estimating. Is it okay?
Sure.
Yeah. So yeah, of course we don't take this into account, but in a way it might turn out that in the long run there was kind of a blessing in disguise for the Donbas economy, this destruction of its basic industrial core. The coal mines, which were one of the key sectors of the economy, they were actually quite unprofitable. They were costly to run, and I believe that the closure of those mines it's only going to be beneficial for the economy in the long run. The same goes for many of the steel mills. A few of them have been remodeled, have been switched to new technologies, but a majority was very inefficient and would have required really extensive, really significant investment into making them more cost efficient, more profitable. So probably it's kind of good in the long run that they are able to get rid of this legacy of specialization in these sectors and could build their specialization from scratch. But what, of course, FDI would be needed for this. FDI overall are needed for the Ukrainian economy because investment accounts for a very low share of GDP currently. And the economy itself doesn't have enough costs, enough resources to cover investment into infrastructure and new technologies, and particularly to Donbas, that would be really important to attract foreign direct investment if the conditions are favorable for that. Thank you.
Should I maybe, are there any comments you want to make? Or should I read maybe some more?
Yes, I would like to add something.
Yes, please, Elina.
Thank you. Thank you. Very interesting questions were asked, and I would like to add my 2 cents to the discussion. The one question regarding UK and China. Now, the Brexit process will certainly bring advantages and disadvantages, both advantages and disadvantages for Ukraine. Why? On the one side, Ukraine will lose a very strong supporter throughout the whole sanctions process right from the start, and also a country that has been very, very tough on Russia for various reasons. Now, on the other side, this is the disadvantage. This might create new opportunities in terms of a future bilateral agreement that would be possible once UK exits the European Union, be it in the field of trade and finances. And let's not forget that the second most important financial center of the world, next to New York, next to the United States, is in UK. That might create huge opportunities for specifically the financial sector in Ukraine. Now, this brings me to the next point, which was brought by Mr. Kochnev, which is really great point and very, very important one. I think that countries such as Ukraine will not going to catch up with the developed economies the way we understand it with the old paradigm of development, economic development, but due to the fourth industrial revolution, will make a huge jump. And he mentioned services. Now, with the COVID-19 situation, we've been observing already a reconfiguration of the global supply chains away from China. And now I'm coming to the second point on China. That would mean that Europe might and will, in fact, consider bringing supply chains back to Europe. And where do you think these supply chains will be reconfigured, if not in Central and Eastern European countries, and specifically in the sector of services? I see great potential for the Eastern European countries, including Ukraine. Now, China is certainly already in the region. We would need another session alone to cover the topic of China. China sees the post-Soviet space in Central and Eastern European countries, including the 6 Eastern Partnership countries that were later added to its Belt and Road strategy, geo-economic strategy, as the backdoor to the most industrialized heart, so to say, of the European Union, which is Germany. So how to approach Germany, if not by entering through the back door? That means all countries that have the possibility of entering the common market at some point, becoming part of the common European common market, are interesting cases for China. That is why now, seen from the Ukrainian perspective, that opens opportunities for some kind of navigation in this geopolitical playground. That means political leverage, but also economic leverage. And additionally to that, with China being quite stressed now due to COVID-19, specifically because there is a lack on the demand side, there will be more interest, of course, to approach firstly and mostly the countries being part of its Belt and Road strategy before negotiating further deals with countries that are not part of it. And last point, let's not forget Turkey. Turkey is a big supporter of Ukraine's sovereignty, even despite the geopolitical rapprochement with Russia because of other issues. We should not forget that this is also something that creates open space for navigation in this very volatile region. That means that the political elite has now more options than back in 2014, and these options would create further alternatives. But let's not forget just to keep the focus, which would be once again the accession, political accession, economic integration with the full package, like I said, with the 3 components, including institutions, including the key fields of policy, and including, most importantly, the citizens of Ukraine.
Peter, should I maybe not?
Yeah,
I thought I would read,
please.
maybe summarize the remaining questions. Okay.
Okay.
Because there was one also on why not having a quid pro quo situation and exchanging Crimea for Donbas. One comment, another one. Given the situation, maybe Ukraine should just give up on Donbas. And in a similar vein, third question on the whole issue of sovereignty, and maybe also the Western partners are defining that not very well, and might be an impediment to the whole process. So this type of questions arise, and also what can Ukraine government do to work toward more inclusive policies for the people of Donbas. Another question on how Ukraine's sanctions affected the certain areas and what were their ways to circumvent these. And here is also a question on why not really starting to build up even now and not waiting for the reintegration. And finally, I have here also from Michael a possibly unrealistic suggestion, but why not make an aggressive attempt to locate industrial parks in the Donbas region which specialize on cross-border production cooperation with Russia, and there you could then also have Western and Chinese investments. Okay. Any thoughts on some of these points? This, I think, should be now a final round. We are already more than 1.5 hours into our webinar. Peter, do you want to start?
Well, yeah, okay. I just very briefly, I will not comment on these geopolitical issues, Donbas, Crimea, and so on. I would just like to point out that the official position of Ukrainian government is that it wants not only Donbas to be reintegrated in Ukraine, but of course Crimea is a part of Ukraine, and that the annexation is illegal. So this is the official position, which is at the moment one of the perhaps issues which prevent somehow the Donbas reconstruction. I wanted to provide some few thoughts about one specific aspect of the industrial restructuring, and reflecting the situation about the coal mines and the revitalization of the coal mines. As was mentioned by Artem, this is a substantial part of the Donbas economy. Unfortunately, for different reasons, for environmental reasons, financial reasons, and so on, it is probably not realistic to expect that coal mine production will be revitalized. Basically, realistically speaking, there is no chance to get some Western bank credits for revitalizing coal mine production. This is the option which is out of question, especially for the environmental policies of major financial institutions. This means that some frozen of the mines or stabilization, preventing the further environmental degradation, would be already a success. But, and this is big but, the question is, what are the social and labor market implications for people who have been working in these mines, who were dependent on the income from the mines? It's very easy to say that, okay, they should restructure, they should move to other employment opportunities, but this is indeed one of the greatest challenges and probably one of the part of the costs of this humanitarian capital. So again, one see that there are so many complications, and unresolved issues that definitely make the Donbas reconstruction extremely challenging. So thank you. This is my
Thank you
comment.
very much. Any other thoughts on the questions? Artem.
Yeah. So I think there was two streams of questions. Yeah, there were questions related to the economic parts and calculations themselves, and the other part related to political stories. Yeah, I will start with the economic part a little bit, related to how to channel this efforts in case of there is still LNR and DNR administrations in power. And the other part related to like whether the reintegrating is considered only for uncontrolled now territories or not. Well, first of all, no, the reintegration is considered for the whole region as Donbas, and that was the purpose of our study. We treated this region as a whole unit. Yeah, because we define it as a part of a single country, and that's a deliberate decision. The cost for certain areas or uncontrolled territories, of course, they're going to be bigger. Partly because the economic situation there is way more grim than in controlled territories. And you can find it in the report. You can just compare the wage rates in different industries, which is actually unique data. You haven't seen it before. We've scrapped this data from the respective websites, from the DNR and from the respective website of the Ukrainian job websites, and then compared different industries. And the gap is somewhere between 14% in the lowest case, it's usually PR and marketing, and something close to 70%. Of course, in the favor of the government-controlled territories. So no, you will need efforts for both of these regions. And one of the biggest issues is how to restore the connection between them, right? Because previously it was a highly integrated economy, both in terms of the internal trade and the internal value chains, and also with external trade. Part of that was very tightly linked to the customers in Russia. And disregarding this and just cutting it off, it would not be a sound policy. In fact, the authorities would need to think how to keep the close connections really going. And we know from all evidence I know from the trade studies, if you allocate it closely to some place, it's very natural to trade with it. It's just because distance matters. Yeah. Regarding whether you can channel these things through the administrations of DNR and LNR, it's highly contingent on what the peace agreement will look like. Because currently what we have some kind of a plan of a peace agreement, in fact, which is the Minsk II Accord. But it's not very detailed. Yeah, it's a sort of a framework document in a way, which prescribes certain actions to be done. But it's not specific enough to deal with this sort of issues, I guess. So I do not assume, this is my personal opinion, I do not assume that you will have the DNR and LNR administrations in place when you're going to execute all these measures that we prescribed. You would have new administrations, but they should be local people. I don't think you will have enough levels of legitimacy among the local population if you will send some politicians coming from, even from Dnipropetrovsk or region or from Zaporizhzhia. No, I don't think this will work necessarily, because people would like to want that their voice is heard and their needs are heard. So they need to bring their own political leaders. And this is a very tricky issue for the Ukrainian authorities, because in any case of what I know in conflict resolution, the authorities, the government, they needed some kind of alliance. They needed some kind of internal support of the territories they wanted to reintegrate back. And currently, there is not so much going on there, because the authorities of DNR and LNR, they are usually disregarded pretty much by the Ukrainian government as the standalone partners. And the channel, like the most of negotiations, is directed toward Russia. It's a reasonable approach in terms of affecting the basic setup of the conflict and the stage of it. But it is important to have some internal political support there, and there you have a massive shortfall currently. We see from the surveys that the values of people located or living currently in the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic, they seem to be very, very different from those that are located in the government-controlled areas. And there is a big gap, and there needs to be a consensus among elites and the Ukrainian society itself how to really close this gap and what to agree on. Because people have just different view of the world in terms of who is responsible for the conflict, who should take care of the cost of the conflict, and all related topics. You can look at the surveys of Choice. You can look at the surveys that were done by Zerkalo Nedeli. This is a Ukrainian newspaper, and you can see the effects. Now, in terms of political stories, there were many questions related to the fact that what is the role of one country, another country, United States. I think it's important to keep in mind that for Ukraine, this issue, this war, is the matter of survival as an entity, as some kind of political entity. For any other country, including Russia, this is not like that. It will in any case have a lower priority than for Ukraine, including for the United States. I don't think that the United States cared really that a lot about Ukraine per se, right? Because otherwise, when the Crimean story would happen, people would not respond just with economic sanctions with a lag of, I don't know, 3-4 weeks, right? There would be some more material actions going on, yeah? So for Ukraine, if you want to go, as a politician at least, you would go from a very conservative scenario, meaning that your external partners will not really move that much forward in that respect. Because European Union, United States, they have their own internal problems, including United Kingdom as well, and China too. And for them, this will be the first priority, because if you're a politician, you care about the next elections more than about the next elections of your partner. This is very natural. I hope so.
Okay, maybe you can come to a end.
Yeah, so I would say that Ukraine should not rely too much. It should not put too much emphasis, or just hope that the Western partners or any partners will help them to resolve and put pressure on Russia, and this will resolve the issues. It will be much more contingent on the actions of Ukraine and how the internal political dynamics in Ukraine will look like. Because currently, the President Zelensky, however he wants to achieve peace, he's strongly constrained by the internal movements, yeah, and the parties that always want to bring the point that we don't want to sell Ukraine to Russia, something along these lines, and this will constrain his ability for a political maneuver. Thanks. That was all from my side.
Olga, do you want to have a brief comment at the end?
To a large extent, I agree with what Artem said, that not much help can be expected on the side of the Western partners. So some kind of sanctions, and perhaps not much more in the short run. But I'm less optimistic about the scope of actions which the Ukrainian government has at its disposal. I don't think that much can be done unilaterally in this game. A lot depends. I think the biggest role here in this conflict belongs to Russia, and it holds the key cards in this conflict. And making concessions, trading Donbas for Crimea, etc. This is not going to be any viable solution either, because as Vilena was saying, the primary geopolitical interest of Russia here is to have to maintain the conflict, and it's not interested to have a settlement actually at the moment. So I might be quite pessimistic, but I think it just reflects the reality here. And responding to the question of Michael about industrial parks, I'm afraid that there won't be enough demand for this kind of risky enterprise. There is not enough demand on the side of investors to come to parts of Ukraine which are far away from the military conflict, and being that conflict unresolved, I don't think it's going to work out in the short run. Thank you so much.
Ambassador, would you like to have a last comment on discussion?
points of this truly interesting discussion. First on UK and China. You know, the two are member countries of the Security Council. And there is a Security Council resolution 2202 from the 17th of February 2015 endorsing the Minsk agreements. Now, should there be a solution, as Peter has foreseen, with another agreement, then probably this would have to go, this will also go through the Security Council resolution. So as permanent members of the Security Council, UK and China will have a role. I think UK had, if I may say it this way, a certain element of frustration that it has never been part of the Normandy 4. And the Normandy 4 came into being in 2014, and the UK was not part of it. There was no Normandy 5, but a Normandy 4. And not a Normandy 5 or Normandy 6, including also the US. It was the Normandy 4. But my observation has always been that the UK has kept a very close eye on the developments. The embassy, the UK embassy in Kiev, was very much interested in the results, if we can speak about results of the negotiations, or as you know, how did the negotiations developed in Minsk. So they had kept a close eye on this. China, I wouldn't say that they kept a very close eye, at least not to what I have seen on the development of the negotiations. But certainly China might be interested to be an investor if there is an attractive scheme in the future, and then it will certainly have a role, as I said, in the Security Council. So this on these two. As to the future of the coal industry, I share all the comments made, also especially by Peter. You have seen lately closures of coal mines in the certain areas of the Lugansk region, and this has resulted in some social conflicts in these certain areas. Some of the other coal mines, like for instance the biggest coal mine of Ukraine, that still is called the Komsomolets Ukraine. It is working certainly not in full capacity, and what the future will be there, God knows. But I think the population there in the area itself knows that restructuring will certainly be necessary, and they are, I think, aware of it. There is also the other prospect of shale gas in the east of Ukraine. There is shale gas. Whether there will be investments in this also environmentally very hazardous area is something else. So I would not want to comment on this. I don't simply know it from the economic side. And then finally, let me say again, I think we have to look at the developments in Ukraine. And this, at the moment, we have seen an interesting development also in the composition of the Ukrainian delegation now in the talk of Minsk. In the Minsk talks, they are only now by video, by Zoom. There are no Minsk negotiations in Minsk directly, but there have been representatives from the areas of the Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts, IDPs, added to the Ukrainian delegation. And this has given a certain new element to the talks. And the question arises, who speaks for the inhabitants of the Donbas area, for the two oblasts, for the Lugansk and Donetsk oblast? Is it only the people who are now residing in the certain areas, or are these people also who are from among the IDPs? And this is quite an interesting development. There are IDPs also as members of the Rada. So there is, I think, a certain very interesting element that one has to see, but I still am hopeful that internally, in the internal political discussion in Ukraine, there is an element and the willingness to go and have a solution, especially as it is written in the Minsk agreements, the decentralization process and the holding of local elections.
Well, final words of today's discussion for Belina. Belina, do you want to make a last?
Yes.
Yeah,
yes.
thank you.
I didn't want to sound pessimistic or anything like that. In fact, I just wanted to provide you with as realistic as possible status quo, so to say, analysis what is on the ground when it comes to the geopolitical and geoeconomic challenges. So I really would like to stress that in fact I'm not a pessimist, and I would like to make the point that given that we are all now in the post-COVID-19 context of trying to revive the economies and trying to prevent actually long-lasting recession, my expectation is that Russia will be pretty much preoccupied with the political affairs, domestic political affairs, as regards to Putin's plan of constitutional reforms, and also certain involvement such as abroad, such as Syria, so that my expectation is that there will be no serious deterioration of the situation in eastern Ukraine when it comes to Russia's participation. That probably is my good news for you. And like I said, the post-COVID-19 situation is actually offering more, certainly a lot of distress, but also new opportunities, new geoeconomic opportunities for the region, including Ukraine. And Ukraine should actually consider opening up now before the rest has actually realized these advantages. Like I said, digitalization, fourth industrial revolution, political leverage due to the fact that certain actors are now being active on the ground, next to the very well-known ones, and all of this with a very smart, of course, smart political approach. And like I said, building on the already agreed plan with the European Union on the way to accession, because it's not just about accession. This is a full-scale package for Ukraine, how to achieve good governance and functionality when it comes to the state in the long term. Now we don't see the positive effects yet, but at some point there will be positive effects. And we all know about the famous example with Poland and Ukraine 30 years ago, and where Poland and Ukraine are right now, with the one country being member state of the European Union and the other one trying to join the common market at some point. This is another good news. And third, final point, Russia has major disruptive power. We should recognize this reality, but Russia does not have major reconstruction power. The reconstruction will come from other actors. European Union and its member states have this potential. China was mentioned, has this potential. Russia certainly not. And that is also good news for Ukraine, because out of necessity, other actors and certainly international organizations will have to be involved in the process in the long term once reconstruction plans are being in the making. Thank you very much.
At the end, a few good news. mentioned. And well, I would like to thank to all of our speakers today, to the authors of the study. The study can be downloaded from the website. It's also here in the handouts on the upper right-hand side. You can see both the study as well as the presentations that you can download there as well. And well, thanks to all the attendees that are still here with us after 2 hours of a very intense discussion. Thank you very much to all, and hope to see you again in one of our next webinars. And have a nice evening.